Hello, and thanks for joining me here for another episode of Storytime. Today's story comes from my newest collection, Peripheral Visions and Other Stories, and the story is called The Flowerbed. Margaret lay still and silent on her narrow bed, listening to the sounds from the floor below. After so many years, she could picture his actions as clearly as though she was there, watching him. There was the sound of the key in the lock, Frank fumbling a bit. Was it the alcohol that blurred his vision, Margaret wondered, making it harder for him to focus on the narrow brass opening? The door opened and slammed shut again, and the slithering noise that followed meant he had failed once again to hang his heavy work coat on the old-fashioned coat rack. Then, a muttered expletive as he located and switched off the small light she had left burning. As much for him as for herself. Those nights he stayed late at the bar. Without a light, he would someday stumble and fall down the narrow staircase leading upstairs. And in the morning, it was so dark when she arose, too early for even the sun to light the cold house. She could use the light to guide her steps as she came down to make Frank's coffee. He knew she needed the light. That was why he shut it off, risking his own neck in the process. He didn't like money wasted, and her safety and comfort were not reason enough to spend precious pennies for electricity. There were other small economies Frank insisted on, making Margaret's life more difficult and harsh than necessary. Her grocery budget was so restricted that all she could afford were the cheapest cuts of meat. Still listening to the sounds below, she ran her tongue over her teeth, able to taste the greasy film left by the meatloaf she had made for dinner. The butcher must have given her the pound of hamburger with the most fat and grizzle. Frank would have hated tonight's dinner had he come home. But he had gone straight from the mill to the bar and undoubtedly had some kind of a meal there, washed down by beer after beer while he brooded on life's injustices. It gave Margaret some hours of peace when he didn't come home for supper, but it was a peace dearly bought and paid for. Alcohol brought out the worst in Frank's nature, which, even at its best, fell far short of what a woman would want in a husband. Margaret sighed. There was no point in thinking about it anymore. After 30 years of marriage, she knew what Frank was and what she could expect from him. Imagining what might have been would be more destructive to her sanity than any action of his. There was a sharp creak from the staircase near the bottom, she judged, as Frank slowly came upstairs, one hand tightly gripping the rail. It groaned in protest, and not for the first time Margaret wondered what would happen if, just as Frank put his full weight on the railing, it pulled free from its support, leaving him with no secure handhold. He would fall, she thought, but then he would just get up again, coming back up those stairs even angrier than before. He wouldn't die. He was too big, too strong, too angry to die. He would live forever, tying her to this house with him. And that is just a brief excerpt from a short story called The Flowerbed. As you could tell, it's not exactly a cheery story, but it is a story about a woman trying to make the best out of the life she had. She recognizes what her husband is, and as you read more of the story, you will learn that she also has some pity for him. She understands that for all of his anger, all of his attacks, he is also miserably unhappy. He also feels attacked, abused by life, by the system. Who knows where his thought process takes him. And all she's trying to do is just get by. day after day. So where did this story come from? Well, sometimes it's hard to think about where a story originates from. Some are more clear, and I've shared those with you. Other times I'm not entirely sure what the story is. Certainly, we have known people who are so unhappy with the hand that life deals them, with the circumstances they find themselves in, that they either take it out on other people or they find they are unable to move out of the chains that hold them back. In this particular instance, the relationship between Margaret and Frank really shows both of them. Margaret is trapped in the marriage. Frank is trapped in his life situation. And interestingly enough, they're not necessarily restricted by anybody else. People sometimes think they can't make a change. People sometimes think they can't do anything to get out of the situation they're in, but in reality, they can. They either choose not to, preferring to complain, or they feel so beaten down, so helpless, so hopeless that you could open the door. You could shine a light on that open doorway. You could stand on the other side of the open doorway and say, here, come over here. It's better over here. And they just stand there and look and then turn their back. You'll have to read the story to find out what happens. Does Margaret find a way to escape from this terrible relationship she finds herself in? Or does Frank find some way to come to terms with this situation and perhaps not be the way he is? I don't know. Well, I do know, but I'm not going to tell you. You have to read the story to find out. But in any case, that is this particular story. Sometimes the stories I tell are stories well, most of the time, I would say the stories I tell are stories to maybe shine that light. Somebody might be reading the story, and as they get into it, they feel a little bit maybe of deja vu, or they feel a little discomfort thinking, how did she know this is my life? How did she know that this is what I'm going through day after day? And what I hope is that with the stories that I tell, with the characters' lives that I share with you, that if you yourself are perhaps finding some discomfort in the resemblance to your life, the fictional life that I've detailed to your own life, maybe the stories might give you some idea of what to do. It depends. I don't know. But in any case, that is today's story from our Storytime episode. And I hope you were sufficiently intrigued, interested, curious to pick up a copy of Peripheral Visions and Other Stories and read about the flowerbed and see what happens next. That is all a storyteller can really hope for, is that as we tell the story, if we don't take it all the way to the end, but stop at some interesting place, that our listeners will want to know, what happens next? What happens? So thanks so much for joining me here at Storytime, and I look forward to sharing another story with you at our next meeting.